Okay then, hello everybody. Lovely to welcome you all to the Humanities Center for the opening session of our new Tuesday series on the desert. This, as you'll know, is the second part of our 6-part series on natural landscapes and human meaning. The project as a whole is a very conscious, though also organic attempt to draw into conversation those working in the arts and those working in the sciences. And it is the expression of a conviction that human intellectual endeavor works best when what C.P. Snow famously called these two cultures pool their perspectives. So in that manner, we'll be looking at the desert from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives, and our sessions will be augmented by 2 striking exhibitions in our gallery, which feature currently the time-based art of Shirin Neshat, and from March 13th, the Southwest prints of Emma Stibbon. Today's session will have an orienting function as we reflect on what the desert is and on what it may evoke. Joining me up here today is a much admired colleague from the College of Arts and Sciences, Beth O'Shea, a professor in the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences. Dr. O'Shea received her PhD in geology from the University of New South Wales, Australia, and was subsequently a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University. She is a specialist in the field of arsenic geochemistry, with a particular interest in the health and environmental impacts of contaminants in waters, soil, dust, and marine sediment. In recent research projects, Dr. O'Shea has investigated metal contamination from a cannery in Mexico and assessed the transport of arsenic from an abandoned mine in San Diego. Her interest in providing a geologic lens for the humanities has resulted, among other things, in the class she and I are currently team teaching, a class called the Desert Sublime, which includes an immersive field trip to Death Valley. In today's session, I'll say a few words about the humanistic approach to the subject of the desert, and then Beth will enlighten us as to what a desert actually is. We'll have a little Q&A session at the end, and then you're all welcome to stay for our lovely opening reception here. Before I get going, I want to say a word of thanks to all those faculty members who have contributed their time and their reflections to the Natural Landscape series, to the 18 speakers who talked about the ocean last semester, and to the 17 who will offer their thoughts on the desert this semester. As ever, enormous gratitude is due to the incomparable Lindy Veer for her organizational skills in making this thing come together. And I'd like to give also special thanks to those 4 people, all of whom are here, Ron Kaufman, Beth O'Shea, Derek Cartwright, and our wonderful dean and friend, Noel Norton, whose insights laid the foundations for this entire 3-year project. I am hugely indebted. Okay, I want to start by taking a bird's eye view of the landscape project as a whole, and a good orientation point will be a passage from Yi-Fu Tuan's book, Romantic Geography, which, as some of you may know, lies very much at the root of this landscape project. He writes this: "The Earth as a planet arouses wonder, prompting a tone of expository writing that is non-utilitarian, elevated, and romantic. The same tendency applies to the Earth's large natural subdivisions that resist human habitation, such as mountains, oceans, rainforests, deserts, and ice plateaus. Not being habitable, or easily habitable, they free the human mind from the need to deliberate exhaustingly about how to make a living and turn it instead to satisfying its more playful and intellectual bent." As an aside, this passage is redolent of what Sigmund Freud wrote. It's Freud, great photograph of Freud. What Freud wrote about the contrast between thinking about reality and the playful exercise of daydreaming and fantasy life. We have both of those elements in our psychical life, Freud says, one more pleasurable and non-utilitarian than the other. And he provides, as an analogy, the way that a nation whose wealth rests on the exploitation of the produce of its soil will yet set aside certain areas for reservation in the original state and for protection from the changes brought about by civilization, e.g. Yellowstone Park. It was lovely, I think, that Freud name checks Yellowstone Park. He'd never been there, it was interesting. Now, that connection between the life of the mind and the life of a nation seems enlightening, at least to me. It also seems useful for thinking about desert spaces, which at least have the appearance of being utterly worthless from an economical point of view, and to which human beings might withdraw, even just temporarily, when they've had their fill of the demands made upon them by both social and work life. The image I show here of the Death Valley Badlands encapsulates this well. Beth has told me that these things are called badlands, partly because they are unsuitable for agriculture. Bad land for growing things, or as Edward Abbey beautifully puts it, totally useless, quite unprofitable. Now, the liberation of such land from economic exploitation opens up a space for contemplation and for imagination. Now, it may seem a dramatic leap to go from the ocean, our subject last semester, to the desert's arid and parched wilderness, the apparent antithesis of the ocean's cold, clammy, unknown, and watery depths. Two significant things, of course, make this transition easier for us. First, we may register the words of one of the unquestionably great writers on the desert, the aforementioned Edward Abbey. It's a lovely photo of Ed Abbey. The desert is a vast world, an oceanic world, as deep in its way and complex and various as the sea. Of course, this is from the great book, Desert Solitaire. Now, the ocean and the desert may also, of course, be held up before us as paradigmatic examples of sublime landscapes. Vast, rough, astonishing, silent, and a cause of terror in front of which we shrink, as Edmund Burke puts it, into the minuteness of our own nature and are in a manner annihilated. This is the import, I suppose, of Edwin Wade Teale's judgment on the unsettling experience of being in the desert. He says, it is easier to accept the message of the stars than the message of the salt desert. The stars speak of man's insignificance in the long eternity of time. The desert speaks of his insignificance right now. The echo of Pascal here is surely intentional. Pascal and Pensées back in the 17th century, of the eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. Worth here just noting again the image I previously showed. This is one of Emma Stibbon's striking prints of the southwestern desert. Spoiler alert, coming to a billboard near you very, very soon. It will feature in the exhibition of her work opening next month here. And thanks again, as always, to Derek, the great Derek Cartwright, for his work in putting that show together. Now, there's something in the kind of
barren desolation we experience in the desert that seems to work particularly upon the religious imagination. Yi Fu Tuan, in a rather fascinating essay called Desert and Ice, Ambivalent Aesthetics, charted two very different ways in which the religious response may operate, both drawn from the Hebraic Christian tradition. The first highlights how the sparseness and hostility of the desert may suggest thoughts of divine punishment and wrath. And these are the words of Yi Fu Tuan. Desert wilderness signifies the unsown. It is a howling wasteland, a realm of evil spirits beyond God's presence and even somewhat beyond his control. One explanation of the desert waste is that it was a consequence of God's curse. Adam's fall brought with it the decay of the earth. I have included here this picture of a Joshua tree, not because it relates to anything biblical. The Judean desert is somewhat different from our southwestern deserts, but because the Joshua tree got its name, purportedly at least, from another biblical source. One story tells that the name was given to this species of yucca plant by Mormon settlers as they crossed the Mojave Desert in the mid-1800s. The shape of the plant reminded the travelers, it said, of the story of the prophet Joshua raising up his arms to the sky in prayer. Very, very strange plants, and any of you have encountered them, so you never forget the experience of seeing a Joshua tree for the first time. Now, at the other end of this spectrum, the desert was felt to be a place almost uniquely suited to spiritual practice. Now, this is connected with the felt simplicity and intensity of the desert, as opposed to the bustle and superficiality of city life. In St. Jerome's words, to me, a town is a prison, and the desert loneliness of paradise. Jerome's words may indicate the manner in which the space and the quiet stillness of the desert allow for a more contemplative attitude than our busy lives generally permit us. To put this another way, and as expressed by the poet Kathleen Norris, person is forced inward by the sparseness of what is outward and visible in all this land and sky. Now, such a thought as this provides a supportable context for noting Belden Lane's fascinating and moving book, The Solace of Fierce Landscapes, a book I like very much. While processing his mother's long and painful battle with Alzheimer's and bone cancer, Lane finds the solace he needs in what he calls the desert's geography of abandonment and emptiness. Great phrase, the geography of abandonment and emptiness. And instead of being reassured of God's personal love for us, Lane explores here the healing value of what he calls divine indifference. It is the desert, almost uniquely the desert, that provides a context for consolation by way of a deep acceptance of our own insignificance and smallness. He says, deserts confront us with a vast horizontal edge, a horizon of emptiness into which we find ourselves absorbed and lost. The desert is intrinsically hostile to the ego, threatening to swallow it up in its endless expanse of nothingness. In whatever form one may find it, the desert loves to strip bare, as St. Jerome insisted. The plain, unadorned desert itself is always sufficient for unraveling and redefining one's life. Its inattentiveness to human anxiety provides an inexplicable healing. Now, desert immersion is here driven by a desire to decenter the ego, though of course desert immersion can have other and certainly less religious motivations. If we return again to Edward Abbey, Edward Abbey was not a man lacking an ego, or really even wanting to lack an ego. there's this very, very famous bit where he surveys Arches National Park from his trailer and calls it Abbey's country. This is his place. And his love of being in the desert seems as much driven by misanthropy as by anything else. Here at last, he thinks you can be away from the toxic follies of other human beings. So among Abbey's motivations for standing up in the desert was the desire, I quote, to evade for a while the clamor and filth and confusion of the cultural apparatus. But even here, of course, it's not just or merely misanthropy. The removal of all that human clamor is necessary for confronting, and it's up here, immediately and directly, if it's possible, the bare bones of existence, the bare skeleton of being, spare, sparse, austere. So, of course, it's noteworthy that such an investigation could only take place in an environment characterized as the desert is by stillness, by sparseness, by silence. Joseph Wood Crutch speaks to this theme when he writes these words from his book, Voice of the Desert. And to those who do listen, the desert speaks of things with an emphasis quite different from that of the shore, the mountains, the valleys, or the plains. Whereas they invite action and suggest limitless opportunity, exhaustless resources, the implications and the mood of the desert are something different. This is a very strange thing now. For one thing, the desert is conservative, not radical. It is more likely to provoke awe than to invite conquest. As a whole, the desert is, in the original sense of the word, awful. This is a great sentence. I love the use of the word awful to describe the desert, dread mixed with admiration or veneration. So far, far more striking to read the word awful here than its near and now utterly devalued cousin awesome. Now, truly, if ever a word required a moratorium placed upon it, it is the word awesome. It's strangely powerless. Given that the word is about power, it's utterly powerless. I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. Now, of course, one thing to pause over here, and something which may seem rather jarring, is that description of the desert as conservative. And of course, that's probably due to the changes in the meaning of that word also, and what it's come to signify, particularly in American political life. Crutch, I think, in painting the desert as conservative, is highlighting two things. Firstly, the silence of the desert, again, and secondly, the very slow changes that occur in it. Now, silence had been a conspicuous feature of the conservative tradition, at least in Europe. Adolf Grabowski, defining the conservative attitude as, I quote, a silent reverence for the impenetrable. There's those words, silent reverence for the impenetrable. And those words are as good, perhaps, as any for capturing the profound feeling that grips us when we find ourselves in massive and foreboding, awful desert landscapes. We cannot grasp it or fathom it. Words fail us. And so in the extremity of the desert, we find ourselves, as Belden Lane puts it, running out of language. I love that. Running out of language in our confrontation with this landscape. Driven, he says, to silence, hence silent reverence for the impenetrable. As for slowness, Crutch knew his Samuel Johnson well, having written a biography of Johnson, and Johnson, old Tory that he was, spoke frequently of his antipathy to radical and ambitious political projects, stressing instead that the progress of Reformation is gradual and silent as the extension of evening shadows. And the desert may, at least for some of us, be suggestive of gradual, imperceptible change, if not of downright immutability. It seems
and I of course emphasize seems, the desert seems solid and immovable, unaffected by the chances and changes and vicissitudes that bedevil our human lives. It's in this context that we can perhaps also think about the desert's relation to our sense of time. All change, of course, taking place in time. And such a theme hovers constantly around Don DeLillo's haunting novel, Point Omega, set appropriately enough in the Anza Borrego Desert, which is itself the topic of next week's session in our series. Now, the desert constitutes almost another character in DeLillo's novel. The action playing out against what is called there, I quote, the heartbreaking beauty and indifference of it. The heartbreaking beauty and indifference of the desert. And in the book, we feel the desert's dominant dimension, namely space, eclipsing the time consciousness of civilized city life. Here's one piece of dialogue between, it's about this aging neocon defense intellectual at the Pentagon, who's now old and has obviously been involved in American, recent American wars. He's now holed up in the desert with a filmmaker and his daughter, Jessie. This is just a bit of dialogue. Day turns to night eventually, but it's a matter of light and darkness. It's not time passing, mortal time. There's none of the usual terror. She said, the usual terror. What's the usual terror? Doesn't happen here. The minute-to-minute reckoning, the thing I feel in cities. It's all embedded, the hours and minutes, words and numbers everywhere, he said. Train stations, bus routes, taxi meters, surveillance cameras. It's all about time, dim-wit time, inferior time. People checking watches and other devices, other reminders. This is time draining out of our lives. Cities were built to measure time, to remove time from nature. Elsewhere in the book, the things that dominate and regulate and characterize our metropolitan lives, the laptop, the cell phone, the watch, lose their meaning in the desert altogether and are dismissed. There's this great phrase as devices overwhelmed by landscape. Devices overwhelmed by landscape. They don't make any sense anymore. We can, again, note Ed Abbey, who makes the same point about the changed being he becomes when he's in the desert, a suspension of time, a continuous present. If I look at the small device strapped to my wrist, the numbers, even the sweeping second hand, seem meaningless, almost ridiculous. There's a memorable, very memorable description in DeLillo's novel of how it feels. It's very good to read this book when you're from San Diego, because there's this description of what it feels like to drive from San Diego into Anza Borrego. And for those of you who've done it, it's a quite a very distinctive drive. This is DeLillo. East into mountains that seem to rise out of turns in the road, and then down through brown hills past rock slide warnings and leaning clusters of spiny stalks. And his description of this drive, I think, captures the sense that many of us feel when we drive into the desert, perhaps more strikingly still when we drive out of the desert after some time spent away from the city. The increasing number of cars we begin to encounter as you move out of the desert back towards the city. More road signs, more traces of human habitation and commerce, many more lanes on the industrially maintained roads. That jarring contrast again between silent stillness and ceaseless human activity. And then the question will be, how does that change feel to us? Maybe it feels good, reassuring. Maybe it feels wrong, like a colossal city-sized mistake. It's an interesting passage where Ludwig Wittgenstein, in conversation with O.K. Boersma, says this:
sort of love this photograph of Wittgenstein, which is very rarely seen. It's quite incredible. Wittgenstein saying, in the city, streets are nicely laid out and you drive on the right and you have traffic, etc. There are rules. When you leave the city, there are still roads, but no traffic lights. And when you get far off, there are no roads, no lights, no rules, nothing to guide you. It's all woods. And when you return to the city, you may feel that the rules are wrong, that there should be no rules, etc. Many of us, by no means all of us, will recognize this feeling as we move between being in the city and being in the desert. The city is laid out for us, is intended to meet human needs, maximize human navigation and efficiency. The desert runs counter to all of those aims. It's not laid out for us. It's, to use Thoreau's memorable word, unhandselled. It's a great word. You never see this word anymore. Unhandselled means it's not gifted to us. It's not there for our use. So it's somehow in opposition to us or in conflict to us or somehow even incommensurable. And yet for some mysterious reason, that desert can revivify our tired souls. Its very emptiness making us feel strangely alive, as John Van Dyke put it. Here's a beautiful photo of you. The weird solitude, the great silence, the grim desolation are the very things with which every desert wanderer eventually falls in love. Now, with that thought, which I think is a beautiful thought, I'm going to pass things over to Beth. Over to you.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for having me. As Brian introduced me, I am an environmental geologist, and he asked that I give the science perspective on deserts. So I guess my scientific perspective in 20 minutes was sort of overwhelming, but it will very much focus on the shape of the desert landscape, the formation, the forces that shape the landscape. In the coming weeks, there will be sessions on desert ecology and desert biology, desert life. And so I very much look forward to seeing those. So I look at this photo. This is a photo I took from Death Valley. And as Brian said, we are going to Death Valley with some students in about 3 weeks' time. So a lot of my pictures are images from there because I've taken students there before. When I look here, I can tell you the chemical composition of the salts in the white part of this photo. I can tell you the mineral makeup of these red rocks in the foreground. I can tell you how this valley formed through faulting and tectonics. But I can't tell you all of that in 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask you a question. And nobody from the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences is allowed to answer. So sometimes in class, I have students close their eyes and raise their hand, but most of the time, like only half the people raise their hand. I won't do that here. So hopefully you have an idea of which of these is the largest desert on Earth. And maybe you're surprised by the bottom right-hand picture here. The answer is Antarctica. So Antarctica and the Arctic make up the two largest, driest places on Earth, or dry places, dry lands on Earth, followed by the Sahara, the Arabian, and the Gobi Desert in Asia. I had to have a kangaroo and the outback somehow, but we're not quite the biggest desert. But I think that this is a common misconception that when people think of deserts, they think that they're hot, they're dry, they're dusty, camels. This is the desert. And this is what the desert is like in Australia. There are camels that were imported. I think it was to make the railroad years ago. So there are camels in the Australian outback with the kangaroos. But deserts can be cold, not just at night, not just the diurnal temperature fluctuations. You know, you'd camp in the desert at night, you're cold. They can be cold because the definition of a dry land, of a desert, is not based on the temperature, but based on the amount of rainfall that the land receives. So here we have the Gobi Desert in Asia covered with snow, this image. And Gobi is a Mongolian word for waterless place. So the definition here of a desert, a place that receives less than 10 inches of rain per year is considered a desert. And Antarctica, I think, is about 15 centimeters per year of precipitation. Hence it's a desert. You notice here the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is the driest place on Earth. Look at what they're wearing. Hands in pockets, their heads are covered, puffy jackets. It's cold. So the desert is defined by the absence of water, or the absence of rain, but not the absence of water, because the water is going to make up most of what I'm going to talk about. But before we go into the power of water and the importance of wind and water in the desert, I thought I would ask you another question I've asked my students, and that is, which discipline is best able to explain why deserts exist where they do? And I'm so excited because the people I randomly chose are all here today. So is it John, a climatologist in the back here? Is John the best person in this room to tell us all why deserts are in their geographic locations? Why is there a desert there and not here? Is it a climatologist? Is it a political scientist? Perhaps the borders, the use of the resources? Is it my mate over here, a philosopher? He would probably argue, yes, it is so. Or is it this person who looks like they are going to eat a rock? A geologist. So again, no one from EOS is allowed to answer, but hopefully you picked the climatologist. So this is me deflecting all climatology related questions to John during Q&A. He didn't know I was going to do this. But really, the reason that deserts are located where they are is driven by the atmosphere and the oceans. So the Earth's climate system is also driven by these two systems, the atmosphere and the oceans. Oceans was our last landscape series in the fall. So there are 5 types of deserts: the polar, Antarctic, and Arctic desert. So cold temperatures lock up all the available water, very little rainfall. The next type here is the Gobi Desert, is circled, so interior deserts. By the time you have that nice, warm, moisture-laden air from the coast that travels all the way into the interior of a continent, there's nothing left in the air to rain out. So that's an interior desert. Subtropical, a very similar type of cause. You know, it's about dry air, but here the air descends 15 to 30 degrees north and south of the equator. So the equator here in this red line, we have the Sahara between 15 and 30 degrees north. That's called a subtropical desert. And it's all about descending cold, dry air in that region. Coastal deserts, the Atacama, which I said was the driest place on Earth. Very cold currents off the coast of Chile, very cold ocean waters mix with the air, and they can produce fog, but the atmospheric conditions to make rainfall are not present. And so the Atacama has a lot of fog, but very little rainfall. And finally, a rain shadow desert. This is the kind of desert the Death Valley is. So we have really nice, warm, moisture-laden air off the coast of California. But by the time it gets to Death Valley, it has to go over 4 or 5 mountain ranges. And every time it does that, it rains a little bit of that moisture out. So it ends up with very dry, cold descending air in Death Valley. The type of rain here, this is a side note, is called orographic rain. And I once had a student who wrote an essay where spell check had changed every orographic to pornographic. Okay, so as I said before, you think of deserts, you think sand dunes, hot, dusty camels, wind, right? You think wind is probably what we refer to in geology as the greatest erosional agent. So it's what is eroding the land, breaking it down into parts and carrying those sand grains vast distances and then depositing them as dunes. And there are erosional landforms in the desert that wind creates. It creates some beautiful sculptures like this ventifact here. So you can imagine the flat side has been blasted with sand grains over time. And with these very distinctive flat sides give rise to this shape of wind blasting that we refer to as ventifact. Or you can get whole ridges, rock ridges that are shaped into what we call yardangs, and these are shaped by wind as well. And of course, what you probably all think of when you think of desert and wind is a dust storm or a haboob. This one happened just last year out at the Salton Sea near us. But really, the biggest force in the desert is water. And so I think it's really interesting that deserts are defined by the absence of water or the absence of rain, but they are shaped by water. So here are Craig Childs. This is a book that Brian brought into our class. And Craig Childs has spent a lot of time walking around the deserts of the American Southwest in search of water. And he writes, humans are absent here because they die. Most victims died of dehydration and exposure, but occasional reports concerned those who drowned, too weak from thirst to climb out of the deep stone waterholes into which they had plunged. So I'm really drawing on this theme of water being a powerful force in the desert. So, example, case in point, Death Valley. Can you see the haze, the heat, the haze in the air? Literally, it's more than 130 degrees in the summer in this place. You come across this sign, there's like hundreds of them, flash floods. For 55 miles, flash floods. It makes no sense. There are 3 ingredients for a desert flash flood. So excessive rainfall in a short period of time. And last summer in August 2020, we have these NASA images here. On the left, you see, I don't have my little pointer, but you can see this is Death Valley. Here is the white salt pan. And this is July 11th, that image was taken. And then in August, they received 75% of their annual rainfall in under 3 hours. And the blue here indicates that actually part of the valley floor flooded. So excessive rainfall in 3 hours. You also need, ingredient number 2, very fine, dry, hardened soils incapable of holding water. And this is that same image that Brian had shown of Zabriskie Point, the badlands. So there's no vegetation there to hold the water. But also these dry silts used to be mud at the bottom of an old lake bed. That's what these yellow deposits are here. They just don't hold water. There's not enough pore space to allow that rain to infiltrate. And so you need a place then for that runoff, all that excessive rainfall to go. The size of the gravels and the foliage to carry these large grains, that is powerful water to be able to pick up a pebble, a boulder that size. And this is why flash floods in the desert, so water is that greatest erosional force. It does the most change, the most damage in the desert. These are all images from Death Valley. And People have been picked up and died in their cars, in particular, in Death Valley and in other flash floods in the desert. Last summer, this particular rainfall event stranded 1,000 visitors in the national park for several days. And they are still repairing the roads. Not all of them are open. And I didn't know that until I checked last week. And so we have to adjust our itinerary for when we go next month because they've still not fixed all of the roads. And rainfall is predicted this week in Death Valley with the storm. So hopefully you understand the power of water in the desert. And I wanted to just end with a couple of two ideas really of why I think the desert is sublime. So this, play on the word, well, it's not a play on the word awful. It is awful, the desert. It's awful. I love it. I love it much more than the ocean. Like, this is my gig, the desert. I have that sense of life in this lifeless place. These are photos I've taken on field trips with students. So yeah, very close up rattlesnake and scorpions. I don't know why you all are afraid of animals in Australia. These things are terrifying. The sunburn, I don't know how many times I've told students, cover up, they always get sunburned. But the two things that I want to point out today that I just think are so interesting and mysterious about the desert, this one here, racetrack playa. Has anyone been there? We'll talk later. We want to go there. It's in Death Valley, but it is a long drive off-road. And so we likely won't get there. But these rocks, they fall off, they shed off the mountains. They land on this dry lake bed, and you can see the trails. Sometimes they're 150 feet, and sometimes they're crisscross. They move, and there was no real reason why they would do this. And Brian tells this great story of being a young boy in England and reading about mysteries of the universe. And there's this page and this black and white photograph of these moving stones at Racetrack Playa, and no one knew how they moved. And he was telling me, when we first taught this class about 2 years ago, no one knows how they move. And I said, yes, we do. We know now. And his face dropped because the mystery was no longer a mystery. And so now we have to do a class on the disenchantment of science every time we teach together. I'm not going to tell you how they move. If you'd like to know, I can tell you afterwards. I'm going to keep that mystery for you. The final sort of sublime example I'd like to give here, I'm going to show you another video as air is pushed through millions of grains of tumbling sand during an avalanche at the Great Sand Dunes National Park. And finally, I want to end with this quote. This quote is actually written in big letters in the visitor center in Death Valley. It's by Edna Brush Perkins in 1922. And she writes, "How can rocks and sand and silence make us afraid and yet be so wonderful?" Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That's fascinating. Our reception will start in about 10 or 15 minutes. But before that, we're happy to answer some questions. Well, remember when we did the ocean series last semester? One of the great joys of that was that I remember at the end of the first session, academics did something that they don't usually do, which is always like trying to score points by trying to make you sound like you didn't know what you're talking about, by asking very difficult questions of us. What we liked that time is that people reflected on their own experience of the ocean or anything. I mean, you can ask, I'm not saying, you can't ask questions, you do what you want, but questions or reflections, personal experiences, anything really, and we'll do our best to respond. Anyone want to make any offer any thoughts here? You're just desperate for a drink after the intellectual intensity of the last hour. Yeah.
The desert, what causes that?
I think it would be much the same as the, air passing through your vocal cords is sort of a vibration. And so I think it's much the same as what we just heard with the avalanche of sand grains. Maybe it's just air passing through vibrations. I don't know. I'm just surmising.
Yeah, Mark.
So just check with Ron, the average annual rainfall in San Diego is 8.6 inches. So San Diego is not in the
Yeah, 10 inches.
This is in California, so that's effectively not in the desert. But we do get less than 10 inches of rain.
I'm not from here.
Technically a desert. Yeah, the reason it's green is because we import water.
Yeah, I would call it a desert.
Without that, it would be really.
I think it's a great example of the disenchantment of science.
Yeah.
Is that, it's a hard 10 inches to 8 inches.
Nice. So order at the back, please.
Somebody told me once it's also the evaporative spray, because we're so close to the ocean. Not a desert, but
These are great questions for the climatologists.
Yeah.
For the city of San Diego, the rainfall is about 10 inches a year. But if you go further inland, especially if you go up to the mountains, it's going to be a lot more. So if you average that for the entire county, it's actually over 10 inches. So according to Beth's definition, that's going to put the county out of the range of desert.
Mike.
I just would like to say that we could appeal to the addicts that accept norm till breakfalls. Your definition.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. Anybody else?
So how does science help us understand the awfulness of the desert?
Oh, that's such a good
Interesting.
question. Well, I mean, this is what comes to mind when you ask that question to me, who I study the environment and the impact to human health. That's really what the focus of my research is. And what I'm curious about, and we are both curious about, is of late, there are a lot of studies on the impact to human health on your proximity, or due to your proximity to blue and green space, right? So blue space is water, green space are parks. And so these spaces, these blue and green spaces are shown to have positive effects on health, particularly mental health. There are no studies that we know of on your proximity to desert and the impact to health, so is this a research gap? And then we can get into the sublime, is it because you feel this sort of vulnerability and that's a type of passion and emotion that the desert incites? I have no idea. I just think it's a really fascinating gap that no one seems to be thinking about. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, Victor, what are you thinking?
No, I'm thinking about it for my own participation in this at the end of the month. But I'm genuinely curious about, how does the desert how does science get us to think about this?
Well, one of the interesting things about teaching this class, which is not to be bombastic, is pretty unique to bring philosophy and aesthetics to conversation with earth science.
we're hoping that those questions can be addressed, well, probably not answered, but at least approached from the meeting of those two disciplines. No.
I know you've been talking about the desert being a swamp. But then you also put this approach. You talked about him saying that the desert is conservative. And that's a way to think about it. I found that fascinating. But then Beth's presentation came up and I started to feel passionate energy. Something that wasn't as conservative. Do you all see the desert as conservative? How do you? And how is it? Okay.
That's a hard no. Yeah, yeah. I think with earth science, the standard textbook for earth science, intro geology, is our dynamic planet. And, and so when I look at the desert, yeah, it can look conservative, like nothing's happening and it's isolating and vast. But there are forces at play. Those earth forces, there is rifting and faulting that is occurring and stress that is building up, just waiting for that fault to break and the alluvial fan to come tumbling down and, like tumbling rocks into the valley. And then the rainstorm comes by and then a windstorm. And then they're often underlain by vast quantities of groundwater. And if you have a fault nearby, that groundwater will shoot to the surface in the spring. So there's a lot there that I think that when we don't always see, but the dynamic processes are at play.
I still like that connection.
I think that makes your argument even stronger.
Oh, good. I always like to hear that.
Yeah.
But the way you're describing the desert, like it's being silent, but all this stuff is happening. Yeah. Sounds like politics. Right? I mean, everyone's like scheming until it like raises to the surface, and then you like do your public campaign, but
Gonna make some notes. Eric.
I was just curious as to some point when this series be dealing with sort of the encroachment of man on this relationship between sort of man and the desert, places like Las Vegas, which is sort of, maybe it's only a matter of time before a big rainstorm comes and washes it all away. But I'm curious that tension between sort of the inhospitable nature of the desert and man's ignoring those various sort of conditions and injecting himself into the environment. So is that something that will be touched upon?
Who knows? This is a great surprise of this series. Yeah, I was thinking, I drove out to Las Vegas at the weekend because I'm a fun kind of guy. And it's such a sort of extraordinary drive to, if you've never driven to, I heartily recommend that one drives to Las Vegas, because it is the juxtaposition of what you see for the longest part of that drive, and then suddenly this thing erupts where it shouldn't be. Or if you fly over Las Vegas, I find that a very moving experience. There's, you can, at nighttime, there's nothing, and then there's this eruption of light. And again, in a place where it shouldn't be, there is this odd encroachment. It's taken an enormous amount of water, energy, electricity to keep that and keep golf courses going there. Frightening questions, but you would have thoughts on that.
Oh, I hate Vegas. Yeah, and actually, yeah. Oh, so many things. Yeah, we don't have enough water for a city that size, but that's a whole other topic. But I will say that I did one Thanksgiving, my parents flew out from Australia, and what does one do when your parents land and they're jet lagged? One drives them to Death Valley. And so we were in Death Valley for Thanksgiving. And then my dad loves Vegas. And so we drove to Vegas, and that was really tough for me. And normally I can go to a city. I'm not averse to cities, but couldn't leave the hotel room because it was so much stimulation after being in this silence. And Dad was straight down to the casino, and he loved America. And I was just in this hotel room thinking, oh, I've got a friend, they're camping at Red Rocks. Maybe I could just leave Mum and Dad here and go out and camp, and I'll be in the silence and there'll be darkness. So yeah, I think that explosion of sensory, like, oh, it's.
Yeah, but you can't get all you can eat shrimp at Circus when you're in Death Valley. But yeah, I've had that before, driving down from Grand Teton, a long way north, down into Vegas, and it was once you adjusted to the stillness of, for want of a better word, the wilderness, and you end up here, it's too much to hold those two things together, at least for me, and for you, clearly. One or two more points. There's a hand here. Ron Kaufman.
I love the way you sort of seamlessly connect your deserts and ocean, like beach, shrimp, and that was remarkably clever.
Thank you.
Things I guess I would say. The first one is my initial background in science was in biology, and one of the things that you see in the deep ocean, one of the things you both alluded to, Ryan, spatially and temporally, is this nothing, boom, nothing. So the desert is essentially, in many ways, at least to me, it has always seemed like a place where there may not be much going on at the moment or in this location, but at a time, and there will be an earthquake, or there will be a flash flood, or there will be a concentration of activity like over Las Vegas or something like that. And so to me, the desert is to some extent about contrasts in both time and space. But the second piece of it as a biologist is I'm always fascinated by desert organisms, because one of the things that one of my committee members pointed out to me publicly, to my embarrassment a long time ago, was that even though the deep ocean might seem like an inhospitable environment, that's an anthropocentric perspective. And if you are an organism that lives there, it is in fact a hospitable environment, and it's the one to which you are adapted. So to me, some of the fascination is looking at organisms that live there and how they're adapted and how they function, and contrasting those with how we are structured and how we function as a way of kind of helping to understand what it's like to exist in a place like that. So again, it's sort of it's a contrast issue, but it's also what does it take to survive in that kind of setting? I wonder if maybe you could comment on that contrast.
I was prepping for our class before I came out this week's Death Valley class, and I think I have a piece of information that will sort of tie all of those concepts together. And what I found remarkable as I was prepping was I was looking at the geologic history of Death Valley, and in a nutshell, the thing that stood out was there are rocks there that are 2.5 billion years old. So some of the oldest rocks on the planet, and they host fossil stromatolites. So stromatolites are very early microbial life forms on the planet. And so when you talk about time in the desert, when I observe these rocks with these fossil stromatolites, I have to grasp this concept that even though I'm in the desert, Death Valley now today, 2.5 billion years ago, these stromatolites formed in a very shallow sea. And then as I trace the history forward, that Death Valley has been a very shallow, warm sea, and then it's been volcanoes, and it's been a shallow, warm sea again, and then dinosaurs arrived, and then it's been lakes. And so that concept of time all recorded in the rocks in a place that looks like very little is happening.
I haven't got nothing to add to that. So I would recommend this Don DeLillo novel that I was referring to here. It's really fascinating. All this stuff sort of there, sometimes spoken, mostly unspoken, as the background to some kind of human action. And it's very, very haunting and moving. Yes, Noah.
Just one of the the conservative, just that there's nothing, something, not just with that. Everything's great. Things are quiet and peaceful, and change doesn't come on. When it does come, it's dramatic. But and all the time and space element frees change to certain specific times that aren't necessarily seen at all moments, like under the sea. So that's constructive.
And this is just to follow up on that. You know, there's a way in which we tend to think in a very sort of pastiche way about what the conservative thinkers have thought. And Burke was always saying you've got to have change. You will fall apart without change. There has to be, and sometimes very, very vigorous change. It can be dramatic, but it's not theory driven. That's the, and I think you could apply that to issues of these spontaneous things that happen in the desert, and it kind of comes back to how it was. So there's that big flood, but you come back in a week's time, it's all evaporates. A final point, Suzanne.
I tend to say that I hope that you don't feel that the racetrack is a magical.
I don't. It's like yeah.
So I have to push against that to say that knowing the science, I don't think takes away from the majesty at all. And I know I'm coming from that as a geomorphologist, but my students that take geomorphology, we think about landscape. I have literally had them say like, oh my gosh, now I can't go anywhere without like driving with my parents. And I think about what happened there. And I told them they're like detectives now in terms of figuring out what happened here and look at the landscape. And I think it sparks their curiosity in a place that otherwise they would look past. And so now, because we have this sense of what happened there, they're like, oh, what went on here? This is so cool. And I love that added knowledge made them more curious than they were.
I want to reassure you that I'm being facetious about, and it is quite stunning to hear the explanation of what happens at racetrack life. The thing about that thing, Suzanne, is that when I was a kid, I had all these encyclopedias, and this was always in there, this great mystery that no person has ever understood. And I thought there were these. Because I read this in a book. I was this high, frightened little boy. It said these things, they are living rocks. I've never seen a living rock, and it's this thing that's slow, like a snail on Valium, moving slowly, and it's just it's always stuck with me until I was disabused. No, but you are right that science opens up another avenue to the sense of wonder. It doesn't cut it out at all. We play this game in class, but it's I think we're on the same page really. With regard to the sense of wonder, we have San Diego's finest wines and beers, and probably a classic cheese plate. That you are all welcome to join. And I do hope those of you who have been here, I hope you enjoyed it. And we've got more of this to come next week. We have Marie Simovich and Mike Wells. Marie was a faculty member at USD for somebody can tell me how many years. And she's retired now, but she's coming back to give the Minerva lecture at the Humanities Center, which is a lecture given by emeritus and retired faculty. Her specialism is on the Anza Borrego Desert. She wrote a gorgeous, gorgeous and beautifully illustrated book on that subject, which will be for sale. So bring your pennies. And that will be the topic of next week's lecture, The Desert on Our Doorstep, the Anza Borrego Desert. I'd like to thank, from the bottom of my heart, Beth O'Shea for giving a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for tolerating our dreadful accents. And please join us for a drink now. Thanks so much.